So thank you everyone for joining. Hannah, do you want to do a bit of an intro and then I'll introduce our guests?
Sure. So this is a series of workshops Gina and I have put together from our separate businesses for B Corp Month. So we're going through the different areas of the B Corp Certification impact assessment. And we're just bringing in some people who've got some really interesting businesses and ideas and viewpoints on what that means to them as business owners and in the wider context of the industry. So today we're talking about the environment, and I'll let all our panelists introduce themselves and let us know why they feel that they want to contribute to this call. Gina and I both are B leaders, which means we help businesses through the B Corp certification. And for those of you that for some reason don't know anything about the B Corp certification and are on the call, it's a framework and a process all businesses in all sectors and industries can do to measure their impact and their sustainability metrics. So if you want to talk further about that, you can talk about that with myself and Gina after the call. My business is Better Not Stop. We help all sorts of businesses create sustainability metrics within their company. So sometimes that is the B Corp certification process. Sometimes it's looking at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and we use all sorts of different sustainability metrics for businesses to grow their impact and their income. And I also run the Better Business Network, which is enrolling up until the 15th of April, which is for business owners that want some help with their accountability and to grow their network. So if you want to hear about any of that post-meeting, feel free to get in touch. My role today is to be keeping an eye on the chat, helping answer any questions that you may have either privately or that you want me to ask the panel discussion, and I'll also be taking notes. So if you want to send me your email privately, I can send you over the notes and a recording of the session afterwards. Also, if you weren't here in the first minute of the call, I have a very whiny sausage dog on the sofa behind me. So if you do hear whining throughout the call, I do apologise. I'm going to be putting myself on mute for most of it though, so hopefully you won't be distracted by that. But thanks for your time today. We're going to be on till exactly 12 o'clock. Gina and I might stick around for 20 minutes afterwards for extra questions, but we are very conscious of everybody's time. So if you do need to drop off earlier, feel free, we won't be offended. Okay, thank you so much. Cheers.
Thanks, Hannah. Well, thank you everyone for joining. My name is Gina Mula. I'm one of the founders of Mulashaker, and we are a creative agency that builds mainly brand experiences across retail, and our mission is to help brands activate change through purposeful design. I've worked with brands for almost 25 years, designing and building retail spaces. I co-founded a retail design agency that was based in the UK and Europe, and have worked with many global brands. And last year, Mulashaker was created to really take those learnings and work with brands and retailers in a much more sustainable way. So today I'm delighted we've got three, I think, big guests this week. Every week has been big, but this week we've got a really big subject to cover. So I'm delighted to welcome Joanna Jakovna, hopefully I've said that right this time. Joanna's a fashion futurist, ex-H&M, other stories. Her mission is to reinvent how the fashion industry and its leadership works with its supply chain to deliver an inclusive and sustainable future for us all. We have Paul De Silva, who's Senior Nature Campaigner from Friends of the Earth. Apart from the Friends of the Earth, Paul leads the work on nature and combines this with charging. For example, National City Park Foundation is a founding member of the London Sustainable Development Commission. And we have Russ Avery, who describes himself as an eco-entrepreneur, specialist marketeer for sustainable brands. And his mission is to do whatever he can to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals to tackle the climate crisis. So thanks everyone for joining. And this week, as part of B Corp Month, we asked the question, what does it mean to be a better steward to the planet? And three very different people from different parts of the kind of circle surrounding sustainability and environment. And Paul, I'd like to start with you, if that's okay. Can you tell us a little bit about you, about Friends of the Earth, and why this is such an important subject at the moment?
Well, I'll try. I mean, Friends of the Earth is a kind of does what it says on the tin kind of organisation. We are friends of the Earth, and we're friends of the people on the Earth. And Friends of the Earth was formed 50 years ago this year, actually, because people then, I wasn't around then, but well, I was around, but I wasn't involved. I've been involved for quite a long time, actually, one way or another. But people saw the planet in peril and saw the impacts. They could connect the impacts that they saw globally with the condition or the deteriorating condition of their area. So Friends of the Earth is an organisation that tries to empower people to be active, to improve the quality of their lives, but do it in a way that's in step with what needs to make life possible for other people and for other creatures that we share the planet with. And, you know, have we succeeded? Well, arguably we haven't. But our metrics are pretty complicated. You know, we're dealing with very complicated issues, which are not separate. People love to separate these issues. So there's climate change over there, and there's waste over here, and there's energy over there, and there's nature and your whales or whatever. They're kind of all linked in a way. And I guess when we get into it, you know, there are ways of looking at an operation, an institution, or a business through lenses such as the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm really glad to hear has been mentioned already, because that's kind of, you know, they're absolutely the right thing. But I think it's then how do you draw that back into your organization and work out what to do about it. But things have come a long way in a very, it has taken time. It takes time for these things to change. So, you know, some of these environmental campaigns are very, they might seem as though they're just dealing with a part of the problem, and in a way they are, but they're through a particular issue, you can see the bigger problem. You can see how acting on one thing helps deal with something else. So, but it's important because we're at a real, all the science basically says we're running out of time to act and to get things right, you know. And I've written some blogs which I'll gladly stick in the chat that you can read at your leisure, which summarize some of those things. But is it doable? Yes, it absolutely is. But it isn't doable if we carry on doing things in the same way, if businesses continue to operate in the way they do, and if our politicians make big pronouncements and then fail to follow through. Is that enough?
Yeah, I mean, such a huge subject, isn't it? We could be here all week. One of the things I read, Paul, that the Friends of the Earth called upon the government to step up to avoid catastrophic nature decline following the UN biodiversity report in 2019. And we are seeing some changes. New Zealand, for example, changed their indexing from GDP, gross domestic product, which measures growth, to people, profit, and planet. And we've seen that big changes can be made, but it's not just big changes, is it? It's also the small things that we can make huge changes.
It is, because the small things add up, or the small things are a microcosm of why the big change happens. You know, that it's ironical in a way, because we try and empower people to realize what those changes are, but the changes can feel small. So we have to show the pathway. What's the pathway? Why are you doing this? And it is about habit forming as well. We do this because it's a value, but we also understand why it matters in, you know, ecological terms or energy terms, or just better governance, you know. And so I think one of the challenges for organisations like Friends of the Earth and others is to always show the relevance of the action, and remind ourselves of why we're doing that. But yeah, I think quite a lot of stuff is changing. You know, having knocked on the door over many years myself, and people on whose shoulders I've stood, and thinking, you know, it's never getting any better. I think there's huge room for optimism. It doesn't mean I'm being a Pollyanna character, kind of thinking everything's nice and rosy and everything's great and I can go away and put my feet up. Much as I'd like to, there's still so much which needs to be done. But I can see the things I was calling for 10 or even 20 years ago are happening now. So the question is, how do we scale up? How do we really, you know, to use the awful football analogy, if I scored one goal, what's stopping me from scoring 3? Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think, you know, one thing that's connecting us all here today is, apart from, you know, creating businesses that balance profit with purpose, is the whole connection to B Corps, where as a B Corp you are legally obliged to balance profit with purpose, and there's this real change to consider the planet in all of the business decisions that you make. Russ, I'm gonna come to you. Thank you, Paul. So an eco entrepreneur, I know you get involved in lots of incentives around pushing the sustainability message as a marketeer to lots of brands and businesses. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and why you have got into this space now?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me today. So I've worked in sustainability for 11 years now, 9 of those as a marketer. And 3 years ago, I left my job in London as the marketing director for a sustainability consultancy to go it alone as an independent marketer for sustainable businesses. And why am I in this sector at all? It honestly just goes back to to my childhood. I was born and brought up on the west coast of Scotland, surrounded by beautiful nature. I know it's a massive cliche, but it's true. I grew up watching David Attenborough documentaries on a Sunday evening with my family, and I've just loved nature and wildlife since as long as I can remember. And I left university with a degree in languages, and I had no intention of using them directly, like as a teacher or an interpreter or anything. So I was kind of lost for a couple of years after graduating, and then I decided that I should really try and get a career in something that I was passionate about. So I managed to get my foot in the door with a small ocean conservation charity called SeaWeb back in 2010, and the rest is kind of history, as they say. I really found my ikigai. I kind of fell into marketing by mistake while I was working there, and I'm now incredibly passionate about the role that business has in solving the climate crisis, because it's a crisis formed by big business, and big businesses can absolutely be at the heart of the solution, and all businesses, indeed small businesses as well. And more specifically, if I go niche than that, I'm really passionate about the role that marketers can play in helping to drive the sustainability agenda, not only in the businesses that they work for, but because marketing and communications is essential if we want initiatives like the Sustainable Development Goals, etc., to be adopted by the masses. You know, marketers need to be working with engineers, scientists who do amazing work, but you know, and who are incredibly intelligent people, but they're not necessarily the best communicators at telling a story. So we all need to come together, and I think marketers can really help to bring these different stories to life. One of which is, as Paul was saying, I'm a great believer in the fact that everything is connected. I'm a huge fan of various different initiatives like rewilding projects and things like that. So I don't know if anyone has seen the video. There's a good chance you have, because it's had like 40 million views, but there's a video on YouTube called How Wolves Change Rivers. And it's about trophic cascades in Yellowstone National Park. I've got some thumbs up there. That's awesome. That's a video that I send it to lots of different people, because it's a fantastic example of communicating something that's quite scientific, trophic cascades. Most of us haven't really heard of that unless we, you know, studied it at university or something. But it brings it to life in a way that just shows how connected nature is, and how actually it knows what it's doing. It's absolutely fine. It's us humans who are the problem, and who have forgotten that we are a part of nature. But if nature is just left alone for a little bit of time, because actually, as the Yellowstone wolves example shows, it doesn't actually take that long for regeneration to happen in a lot of places as well. It's just phenomenal. And I'm aware I have gone off on a bit of a tangent here, but I hope that kind of begins to answer your question and tells you why I'm so passionate about sustainability and the role that businesses can play.
Yeah, no, I love it. And your passion absolutely comes across. And I think, you know, for passion to come through in what you do in your daily life, you know, running a business or working for somebody, then as Paul says, you know, I think this is where we're seeing change happen, because we are putting our passions into action. And we know, working with brands, you know, that link to consumers is all around that emotional attachment, and brands have seen how they can build those communities through that emotional attachment, and it's the big subjects that really matter. And so, Joe, I'm going to come to you, because fashion is seen as as one of the key issues around climate change and societal as well as environmental issues. And we've had hours of conversations already around, supplier chains and the fashion industry in general, and why it's slow to change. Again, another massive subject, probably a separate webinar in itself. But you've worked in that sector for many years, and I'm sure you've seen some horrors, but hopefully you've seen some positives as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that and a little bit about your background?
Yeah, sure. So I've been in the industry about 17 years now. I started off as a buyer, and then I moved to Shanghai. So I was in China for 10 years, working directly with suppliers, sourcing fabric, sourcing the supply base for a wide number of high street companies. I've traveled to most production markets, so Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, and I've really seen what it's like in terms of the supply chain globally. And like you say, there are difficult things that you see, but there's also a lot of positives. And I think COVID has brought a real time of change to these businesses, where they've had to change with supply chains being disrupted. And I see, you know, a lot of positivity in terms of the adoption of digital, which we've talked a lot about. And how almost being forced to change has brought, you know, has had impact on these environmental issues. You know, in terms of, for example, when we adopted 3D prototyping, we can save 70% of our pre-consumer samples. We're saving like 97% of the CO2 that we would have normally produced in the original way by making physical samples.
So sorry, I slightly lost you a little bit. Can you just repeat that end bit?
Sorry, I was just saying, for me, I think COVID has been a great catalyst, because it's forced businesses to change. So where we've talked before about the supply chain being very reluctant to change, you know, it's been forced upon them because of the disruption. So about 97% of CO2 can be saved by adopting digital prototyping. And we've seen an explosion of this since COVID has started. We can save around 70% of physical sampling. So, you know, in terms of where we're looking at waste, we're looking at how can we almost use waste as a resource? How can we reduce waste in the supply chain? For me, those are the good things that I'm seeing at the moment.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Sorry about that. We just lost you for a minute there. So we know that with fashion, I read somewhere that since 2012, there's been a 10% increase in the amount of clothing that's purchased in the UK alone. And by 2030, it's predicted that the industry's water consumption will actually grow by 50%. So when we read these figures around the increases in consumption, and yet, as Paul said, you know, there are some really positive things happening. How do we create this balance, Paul? I'm going to kind of come back to you if that's okay. I mean, the idea is that we don't just reduce the change, but we have to put it into negativity. How do we even begin to do that when consumption is still increasing?
Well, I wish I had a simple answer. There are no simple solutions to some of this. So I think there's an interesting debate. So just in the fashion world, you know, I think Joanna's right. Although I think I went to my first ever sustainable fashion show about 25 years ago. And a very well-known advertiser called John Hegarty basically was the kind of keynote speaker, and poo-pooed it all, because he basically said, you know, you can't stop this, it's run away, and only by creating profits can we solve the problems. And I foolishly stood up and I said, so why don't we save loads of money and avoid some of the problems in the first place, rather than causing a problem in order to pay for the cleanup? And it completely baffled him. But anyway, whatever. I think increasingly people get that. A lot of it's down to design. So as Joanna's talked about, design is your friend. You can be really clever and design out problems. Everything has been designed, you know. So the plastic bottles we throw away, why are they complex to recycle? Because they're made out of at least 4 different pieces of different plastic, which all have to be treated separately. That's a design challenge. So can we redesign that bottle, or maybe use it, you know, people looking at new materials. There's all sorts of ways of doing this. Your question also touched on the broader thing about the trend to just consume stuff. And there are a whole bunch of issues that come to play in that, which are really tricky to deal with. I'm not going to advocate there's a kind of no one could consume anything type argument, kind of no growth argument. That's a debate in itself, isn't it? But I think there are definite ways of reducing impact through looking at the start of your supply chain as opposed to the end, you know, because we tend to use what we call a tailpipe approach. We only deal with the problem once it's been caused, as opposed to designing out the problem. So that's crucial. I think also businesses are increasingly under scrutiny from not just from governments, but from their customers. They have increasingly customers are having to are putting their loyalty where companies are showing that they're doing stuff, and it's more than just superficial. So, and the whole disclosure issue, you know, so the fact that companies having to disclose increasingly their role in climate or energy or pollution, I think is a big driver for change, and being held responsible for those things. So these are not solutions in themselves, they're steps, and you have to look at the different ways they work. But I would love to see advertising change. I would love to see the adverts that actually give high profile to sustainable lifestyles. There are far too many cars being advertised where people are driving as though there's no other car on the road, because they're all going incredibly fast. So where's the Advertising Standards Authority on that? You know, next time you watch TV and you see a car advert, see how fast the car is going and see how few cars there are on the road. That's a classic entrenchment of a bad behavior being made normal. Yeah, but you could apply it elsewhere.
Yeah, that's really really interesting. And there's been some interesting stories recently. Oatly, for example, who sold 10% of their shares to a Blackstone investment company predominantly known for investing in fossil fuels, and their view was, well, you know, we need to help those companies change by allowing them to invest in companies like us. Russ, you know, in terms of work as a marketeer, you know, it's really important for brands to be transparent and authentic and open when they're trying to make, you know, huge changes, and bringing companies on board with that change takes guts. How do you feel, as you know, as a sustainable marketeer? Do you think Oatly did the right thing? Do you think more companies should be doing that to really push that change forwards?
I don't know if they did the right thing by getting their 10% of investment from Blackstone, but I think they did the right thing in the way they communicated it. Yeah. So I appreciate the authenticity and the transparency in any brand comms, whether it's good or bad. I think the clever ones realize that actually their target audience and their customers will appreciate them for the honesty. It's like something that we get a lot is typically smaller to medium-sized brands asking us a question about their sustainability journey. And they're often worried that they're not very far along on it at the moment, because they're comparing themselves to others who have been doing it for 20 years. And the answer is usually the same, which is that just be honest about where you are now and what you're and that you're on your journey. So acknowledge that you're on your journey and that there is no destination, because there's no such thing as a perfectly sustainable business or whatever. And tell your audience in obviously great creative ways and however you can do it, but tell them the honest story about what you're doing to be a sustainable business and what your intentions are, what you want to be doing in the future. Tell them what you're not doing yet, etc. And people will appreciate you for it. We can see that direct tie-in to honest and transparent marketing and advertising with sales and with customer loyalty and things like that. So it really does make a difference. I also just wanted to say, because we've talked about fashion from Joanna, and then Paul was talking about advertising and marketing, it's just such a good segue to give a quick example on messaging and communications, because sustainable fashion is something very close to my heart as well. That's only really been in the last 2 years since I've got to know anything about it at all. And people will say, why does this sustainable t-shirt cost £22? And that's a form of marketing, right? Because it's out there in the world, and it might be a magazine asking it or whatever. But of course, the question should be completely flipped. It should be, why does this t-shirt cost £2? £2, sorry, not £22, So we need to change the narrative in lots of different sectors to make it fit a way that we can communicate sustainability much more effectively. And absolutely, the question should be, why does this t-shirt cost £2? Because if you don't know about sustainable fashion and that's the norm to you from where you buy your clothes, and also, don't get me wrong, some people, I think, I mean, I'd be interested to know what you think about this, Joanna, but I think, unfortunately, a lot of things that are sustainable, it is still a luxury and a bit of a privilege in terms of cost, unfortunately. So some people, the last thing on their mind is thinking about buying a sustainable t-shirt, right? They're just trying to put food on the table and pay their energy bills. But for those of us that can afford to look elsewhere, we should be asking ourselves why this t-shirt costs £2, because you cannot sell a t-shirt for £2 without destroying the planet and exploiting people. That is a fact. So a sustainable t-shirt might cost £22, but that's probably because of the way that they've manufactured and grown the cotton and the fair wages that they're paying to the factory workers. And maybe they've shipped it to the UK instead of air freighted it, and lots of different things like that. So yeah, it's just a really interesting kind of tie into fashion and communications and advertising. And also, just very quickly, luckily, I think consumers, with every year that passes, there seems to be an ever increasing number of kind of conscious consumers, which also means that we're getting better at spotting greenwash, which is good, because companies need to be called out for greenwash whenever we see it. And I think the average person on the street now is maybe becoming a little bit more clued up with every passing year, and is therefore becoming better at spotting greenwash. And Paul mentioned the Advertising Standards Authority earlier. Last year, there was a campaign by Shell which made my blood boil, and it was the Shell Go Plus campaign, which was a new type of fuel that they were selling. Well, obviously it was the same fuel, but it was Shell Go Plus. And if you used Shell Go Plus, which obviously cost you more, you were driving carbon neutral. I shit you not, this is the actual phrase that they used, because obviously what they were doing with that extra money was planting a few trees, supposedly, but it got complained about so much that it was only around for a month or so before the ASA removed it. So some good things are happening in terms of what we're recognizing and stuff, and I don't think brands can get away with the level of greenwash that they were once able to. So we've got to take some positives.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of tree planting going on at the moment, and I think, to your point and to Paul's point, we should be looking at this from a circular perspective. We should be, rather than try and replace what we're already using, and for a fossil fuel creator to create a carbon neutral fuel is quite shocking and frightening, actually, to think that they could even get away with that. But Joe, Russ made some really interesting points there about the fashion industry. Have you got some comments on that?
I mean, I agree with what you say, Gina. I think we need to talk more about circularity. I think when we talk about sustainable fashion, the word sustainable in some ways has become meaningless. You know, Stella McCartney recently said, you know, I don't know what that means anymore. And I think what we need to do is change the fashion system. You know, it's not that we have sustainable fashion over here and fast fashion over here. We have to change the entire system. And it's looking, like you said, into that supply chain. I don't think you can separate environmental from social sustainability. You know, if you take fast fashion away, how do you support the workers in those developing countries? So I think it's complex, but I think what we have to do is take a holistic approach in how we look at this. You know, I think it's 1 in 7 people in the world are employed by the textile industry. So it's massive, but it's how do we do it in better ways? So it's looking at things like digital that I talked about before, but also looking at resale models, rental models. We've got enough clothing there for the next 6 generations. So how do we utilize that? How do we rethink waste? So there's some great things happening in terms of like pineapple leather. So waste products are now being used for materials. We can now grow leather in labs. How do we look at all these waste products in a different way? You know, I think UGG is an interesting example. They've just launched a sandal where they've used renewable sugarcane, which actually takes carbon from the atmosphere. And we just, like Paul said, have to spend more time on the design phase. I think companies have become in danger of constantly producing without, you know, spending that time and looking what's the full life cycle of this product, you know. Also, how is the customer going to dispose of it? I think we have sadly got into a model of just providing the customer with more and more, and I think we have to change that. You know, there's so many issues within the fashion industry. I do agree, Russ, but I think it's very complex, and it really involves looking at it from many different angles to make true change. Because I think if you just kind of change it to sustainable fashion, then the majority of people, like you say, Russ, who can't afford that, where do they go? So it's really systems change that I think will move us forward.
The thing about price is really interesting, though, isn't it? Because I've done some work with looking at cotton, which is incredibly wasteful. You know, it takes a lot of nutrients out of the soil gets depleted, the crop becomes prone to pests, massive amounts of pesticides, lots of worker harm through pesticides and processing, and then there's dyeing and what have you. Dyeing as in colour. People die from pollution and dyeing, but anyway, there is, you know, people talk about early adopters and things like that. You know, I think I see some trends. You'll probably know about this more, Jana, but it's taken a while. That if you talk about price, some of the companies, you know, if Levi's made all their jeans organic, the price would come down overnight. Although they probably put a design premium on it because it's Levi's, yeah. But you see what I mean? There's a lot more organic cotton out there than people imagine, but it's dissipated. But you need a big market mover who would say, we're going to back this because it's the right thing to do, and we can probably help people, we can sustain livelihoods, we probably clear up their health problems as well. And bing, you start getting some of the dividends from that. And then you get brand loyalty and what have you. So I guess on a number of fronts, we're looking for some of the bigger players to start dabbling with this and to start doing it because that's what they do.
And I would say that's definitely happening. I think H&M is actually a great example for that. With organic cotton, there's actually a massive shortage of it at the moment. There's been issues in terms of the organic certification. So there's been a huge amount that's been taken out of the market, but there's only so much quantity that can be grown. So a lot of organic cotton's actually been bought up by those big companies at the moment. And you are totally right in terms of cotton being a very water thirsty crop. But the good thing about it is at the end of its life, it can biodegrade if it's not blended. You could produce a much more efficient fabric with polyester, but then you're left with this legacy that can't biodegrade. So for me, it's looking at the full life cycle of that product. You know, how often is it going to be washed? Is it going to shed microfibers? And I think once we kind of look end to end, and you know, almost ask brands where their responsibility stops. You know, as a brand, we stop our responsibility once we've sold it to the customer. Is that the right thing to do? Should there almost be an extended responsibility policy with incentives backed by the government for doing that? And I think if you did that, brands would really start to think differently about how they designed. You know, if you have to take care of your waste at the end of it, you start to think in a different way. And for me, that's why it becomes a bit tricky, because from a brand's point of view, you know, when you stop your responsibility at that point, you make different decisions. You know, you're much more likely to go with the cheap polyester. You know, that is going to cause a lot of environmental issues further down the line, than invest in organic cotton. But, you know, I talked about H&M because they do, you know, you can read their sustainability policy. There are investments into new textiles. And I think that's the issue at the moment. When people ask me, well, what sustainable fabric should I use? You know, it almost doesn't exist yet. You know, there needs to be so much more investment into closing the loop, using the materials we already have and making them into new ones, whether that's through better recycling, better processing. But that's where the innovation needs to happen for me, not looking at how we can make what we've got better, because we've had a long time to do that already. It's really, okay, how can we change the system? You know, I've talked to Gina a lot about this, but in terms of, you know, in 5 years' time, we might be all wearing digital clothes on this Zoom. We might not need the same amount of physical clothes, because we could almost just get a digital image rendered onto our moving body, because we have a strong digital self now, you know, having moved to home working through the pandemic. So I think it's really looking at those out of the box ideas at the moment that might seem a bit forward thinking, and thinking, okay, how are we going to put those into our business plans? Because that's where we're going to save, you know, save the majority of fabric use. You know, all those issues change completely when you really start to reinvent what the fashion industry actually is.
That's a good point, Joe. And I don't, Russ, did I see you pop up sheep included there in a chat?
Yeah, so I never heard of them until a couple of weeks ago, and then I heard them in a Clubhouse interview, and they're, well, you know, they say that they're carbon negative, right? So they're definitely worth checking out for anyone who's interested. I think it was Alexandra who asked. So yeah,
there's some great brands out there, and they're one brand, Hyatt Denim, McNair Shirts, Nudie Jeans, who all have committed to repairing your product for life. So you buy it once and you have it for life. And it's these smaller kind of disruptor brands that are really making these changes and real commitment to change. We were on a webinar last week, and Elliott Wood, who are huge structural engineers who are based in London, are about to launch a sustainability tool, and that's a real call out to the building sector, and it's all around reusing building materials. Bill Gates mentioned recently, obviously in his book, about concrete was huge polluter when it comes to the effects of climate change. And Elliott Wood are creating this tool. You know, their mission is to reuse building materials in the building sector. So, you know, I agree, Paul. I do think there are some real fantastic positive changes happening, and it'd be really great to just the next 15-20 minutes to just talk more about the positive things that are happening. And I think almost this conversation almost becomes too big for a lot of people to even just, you know, don't even know where to start. What are the small things that we can all do as individuals to make incremental changes, and what are the positive stories that are around currently? That's to you, Paul.
That's me, is it?
Well, it could be for everyone actually.
It's another big thing. I mean, change happens because you believe that you have some agency. Change happens because, you know, and actually we've all talked, haven't we? And people on the call, like, you can all think about how you felt you had some control over something and therefore you made a change. It's also, I agree with Russ, you know, don't beat yourself up because you're not suddenly a 5-star sustainability business. You know, be honest if you're a 2-star, but be clear where you want to get to and what help you need. And there's lots of help out there. There's no shortage of help. You know, I got involved in this racket when there was nothing. You know, as I said, you know, we have to remember the progress that has been made. I do feel as though I'm fighting the same battles, but I keep telling myself, and I'm telling colleagues who are newer to this, yeah, but I absolutely where I wanted to be. I would love, my job is to be impatient. I want us to be 10 years ahead of where we are now. Yeah. So I remember campaigning on the streets of South London, calling for cars to have catalytic converters fitted as standard. Yeah. Or for you to have energy labels on your fridge so you knew how much energy it was consuming. I was campaigning for that. That is standard now. Yeah. So you have to recognize the progress that is made and use that to say, look, that's how we can, you know, learn from that. Well, how does understand how change happens, I think, is something. Connect that to your sense of agency, and focus on one or two things, but see the bigger picture, see how it fits into the bigger picture. So I suppose what I'm saying is never underestimate your own ability to change things, but don't get too frustrated when you don't succeed. So that is born out of experience. It isn't just kind of one of those mantras. The change that's happened, and the reason I feel reasonably positive, although I'm not kind of in denial about the problems, is because I've seen what happens when things do get on a roll. Yeah. And that's why I do think some of the bigger players need to come in. I take Laura's point in the chat about some of the bigger companies. I need to see more of those traditional sectors and companies mainstreaming this and being honest, because I still see a lot of nonsense from those companies. And I deal with the mining companies, I deal with the tobacco companies, I deal with the pharma. So a little more honesty and preparedness to admit would be great, but we can have a conversation about that. So I also think there are going to be companies that don't exist yet, and they may be on the call, who are going to take over. You know, there are some companies or some activities are not going to be, they're not going to be in business in 5 or 10 years' time. You know, I won't, if you want a private conversation, I'll tell you what my hit list is, but not because I'm taking them out of business, because their business model is not going to work. It's not going to be compliant with what we need to do on climate and nature, the ecological crisis. And I would add the people poverty development issue. Yeah, they are going to get found out, and they are already being found out. So, and that's why they very often put into the mix the kind of shell advert that Russ, because they've got to be seen to be doing something. I would far rather have a sensible conversation. And my last point is, just to illustrate this, I get a lot of companies come to me and say, what can we do about, you know, we're really worried, we really like to do. And I said, well, as long as you're honest and open, great. And they said, yeah, but what do we do about offsetting? I said, I'd rather, offsetting doesn't work. Just be really clear about the bits of your company that are on track and the bits that you can't do anything about right now, but you'd like to. But don't pretend that offsetting is where you pretend that you've paid some money for someone else to clear up your mess, essentially. You know, it's like, let's be honest, because actually there's a bit of a racket there. And I think a lot of companies are trying to pretend that, don't worry, we've offset our air miles, or don't worry, we've planted loads of trees somewhere. There's lots of really bad tree planting. There just is. This is the danger of pulling the wrong lever. So really work on, it goes back to design, really work on the quality of what you're designing, and get the help is out there, and Friends of the Earth will help you to not make the mistakes as well. And if you're doing good, we'll give you a pat on the back. If you're trying to pull the wool over people's eyes, you will find out that as well. Sorry, I was finger pointing. I didn't mean to finger point.
I think you were pointing at Hannah. we need to really foster green entrepreneurship, because we can prove time and time again now that being a sustainable business and being a profitable business are not mutually exclusive. They can absolutely go hand in hand, and actually you can be more profitable by operating more sustainably. So there is a massive opportunity for anyone out there who is thinking of starting their own business and who's got that entrepreneurial spirit to create a business that is not only a great business for them and everything they want to achieve from a financial standpoint, but which helps to solve some of the world's biggest challenges that we're now facing. So I'd love to see, the government and people doing more to encourage that. To Laura's comment in the chat, I hosted a chat about this on Friday night in Clubhouse for an hour, and it was super interesting. So basically, yeah, there is no way that British American Tobacco and Glencore, you know, have really good ESG ratings without spin, basically, and the way that you can get around it. It's unbelievable. So, you know, they're often the mining company are often known as like one of the world's worst companies for the environmental damage that they cause. So we had a huge chat about sustainable business accreditations and certifications, including B Corps, obviously, and what they actually mean, like getting under the skin of them. Are some of these ESG ratings, etc., robust and stringent enough? The answer, of course, is that a lot of the time, no, they're not, because otherwise those 5 companies could never be on a list of top 5. So it is a minefield out there, definitely, but there are obviously lots of people who can help in lots of different areas. You've got Friends of the Earth who can advise on all the things that Paul's just talked about. You've got consultants like you, Gina and Hannah, who are advising businesses through B Corp certification and things like that. So the help's out there for people to look to, and we just need to keep fighting the good fight, because time is most definitely not on our side.
I think the thing that, again, is I'm loving at the moment is we're all coming together, the collaboration. I can see Julian's from construction industry, and you know, we're all from different sectors, and we're all having the same conversations, and we're all aligning on making the world a better place, you know, whilst earning a living, and what's enough is enough. And I think all of our knowledge and experience and learnings and pulling all of that together, I think, is making huge changes within communities. And you know, I can see it in our village. You know, we've got orchards in public spaces getting planted. And Russ, I know you got involved in you know, community rewilding projects. And Paul, we've met through Elizabeth Marsh and the Green Ribbon Project, which has brought over 100 people from every sector you could possibly think of, because there is a drive to make a change in the world. And we know the pandemic started because of an environmental issue, which has now created a, you know, a societal issue, which we're going to be living through, I'm sure, for the next few years or forever.
The thing about that is that one thing I've noticed, you know, so I've advised every mayor of London on sustainable development, and that I've been in a room with people who aren't the same as me, you know. So I've been in there with physicians, people from construction, people from, you know, different sectors, but we all came together because we saw our role in the piece of the pie, if you like, we all formed a slice of the pizza or whatever. And the point was that the solutions are not going to be solved because I, as a campaigner or a policy person, you know, they're not going to be solved just because I persuade people. They're going to be solved because the engineers or the surveyors or the designers or the local politicians or the people who can persuade people locally, they come together. And I think this is what's happening. People are trying to work out what the shift is and what their role is, but they're doing it because other people are enablers around that. It's not going to be solved because Elon Musk makes our future. Frankly, I'm not sure I want to live on Mars, whatever. But the point is that it's not down to him. It's down to a whole bunch of people who know what the solutions are. But yeah, there are some political blockages about that, and there are some institutional blockages. There was a survey about 5 or so years ago, which went to the World Economic Forum, which is very interesting, about how the majority of FTSE 250 companies, the chief execs, all really knew that this whole ecological agenda was absolutely going to kill them unless they acted. But they understood the disparity between what they thought and the realities of just doing business on a normal day. So the things they were showing, the amount of time they were featured in the news, or the company was, and the things they said, was a massive gap between what they actually thought. So how to close that gap between thought and action, I think, is a challenge for businesses now, because you've got to start stepping up. Not you. I mean, who are the leaders? Who are the people who are going to mainstream this and are going to create the toe for others to kind of say, yeah, I can do that. So that's why I'm positive, because I see things moving, and because people from different backgrounds and professions are coming together to solve things, which tends not to be the way in the past. So we're de-siloing, smash those silos.
Yeah, it's great.
Cool.
Lots of change.
I was wondering if I could just ask Paul a quick question. When you've been doing this for years now, and when you said, you always want to be 10 years ahead, like, I absolutely get it, and your job is to be impatient and stuff. So I don't know if this is even comparable, but if you compare 25 years ago campaigning about energy certificates and the things you're doing now, and then how now they are, things like that, a standard and catalytic converters and stuff, things that you're campaigning for now, and where we are in 2021, and we keep hearing about the Sustainable Development Goals and how we're nearly at tipping point, etc. I mean, even if in 10 years from now we're seeing some good stuff happening that we wish had happened now, but at least it's happened in a decade's time. I mean, is it going to be a much bleaker picture though, because of where we're at now with, CO2 parts per million and everything else that the climate scientists are telling us? Like, I guess essentially in a roundabout way, I'm asking, like, if you think like we're too late, or if you think we can still turn things around.
Well, my first response is it's never too late. Although my second point is there will be a point where it's never too late. And so the science is very clear. If you want to keep global average temperatures within a safe margin, we need to turn down emissions considerably very quickly. And that's why this year, postponed from last year, is very crucial, both in terms of renegotiation of the Global Paris Climate Agreement, but also the biodiversity conference that's due to take place in China, and the renegotiation of the Sustainable Development Goals. The science is very clear that there comes a point where people talk about tipping points. We're not there yet, but there's a point at which, unless we turn things around, it will breach what's safe. And the other thing is, we also have to be realistic, is that a lot of the problems that have been caused because of existing emissions or historic emissions are in the atmosphere anyway. So bad stuff is still going to happen. So the fact that you see, I don't know, an iceberg break off, ice shelves become icebergs, is down to the historic stuff that we've not addressed quickly enough. So bad stuff will continue to happen. The question is, the scientists will be able to tell us whether we're on the right path. And that's in terms of climate, and it also applies to nature and biodiversity and ecosystems, repairing our ecosystems, the ability of soils to provide good food or air to be clean for us to breathe, and soils to be fertile, because we've got really good data on all that stuff, and we know what levers we need to be pulling. So we can get on a pathway of repairing the damage pretty quickly, but it doesn't mean bad stuff won't happen. So putting my optimistic hat on, always, but being clear that doesn't mean bad stuff. People will still be saying, yeah, but if everything's going to be all right, why is this still happening, I suppose? And that's the conversation we need to be having in our sectors, in our our clusters, on our latest platforms, the one you're on.
So just going on from Russ's point, some really good stuff is happening. So you've got countries committing to net zero, but I'm going to lead with a question here, Paul. China has announced its intention to be carbon neutral by 2060. So that's China. You've got Japan, Hungary, Canada, South Africa, South Korea committed to similar goals by 2050. The UK was looking at a 61% reduction by 2030. It all seems a long way away still, and yet I think we're all aware that we need to make change now. It's a pathway
you get onto. So I don't have a problem with people setting long-term targets, but long-term target isn't, oh, we'll leave it 50 years and then we might hit the target. That's the danger, is what's happened now. Yeah. So we're well off target in terms of hitting what was agreed at the Paris Climate Convention. And same on nature, restoring nature. World governments agreed 20 years ago to get on target to stop causing damage and to restore. And then we breached that target, and then we rolled it on to 2020. And that's been breached. So you do have to stop, again, put my optimistic hat on. Governments rarely lead. My job is to try and get governments to do the right thing and to show that society wants stuff. The role of business is really important, because business is very often thinking longer term than government and is prepared to innovate and take a bit of risk. Some businesses like to just keep milking the profits and pretend they're doing stuff. That's a separate conversation. But let's assume that people on the call are in the first category. They're the ones that government will take a lead from. The government will take a lead from whether people want stuff and whether businesses want to be part of supplying that need. And that's the magic, yeah? Meanwhile, leave the hard stuff to me, although I want your voice in persuading Boris to do better. And so the fact that it feels long-term doesn't mean, my question is, what's the pathway? Are you going to get on that pathway quickly? Because when you get on that pathway, the magic snowball. It's a snowball effect. And magic will happen as a result. The innovation will flow, the design solutions will flow, and then people will find their own solutions as well. So again, at the risk of being over-optimistic, I really do need to go and have a lie down. This is what we can do. This is what it's about. And do you know what? To be positive, there are even some companies who are doing really bad stuff now. I talked about them not existing in future. They might even change too.
Yeah, that's the hope. That's the hope for us all, isn't it? Well, look, there is some really positive things happening. We know because of the pandemic, there's much more collaboration between lots of business owners. More brands than ever seem to be considering their impact. And there's definitely a change in the air, and there are more B Corps happening every day, and more sustainability businesses popping up to help everybody with that change. I can still see questions popping up, but Hannah, is there any questions from the chat, or do you think they've been covered through conversation?
I think a lot of it's been covered through the conversation. I think, Paul's made a very important point there. It's about the businesses making the change so that the governments have to kind of react to that. And, 100 years ago, it started grassroots when the trade union started in 1871. And then within 30 years, we had weekends. So it came from the grassroots, came up to the businesses, and then it went to the government level. So it's exactly what's been talked about the whole session. It's about, we do have agency to make change individually, and then that collectively will make the big changes. So yeah, I haven't got any particular notes or questions in the chat that haven't already been answered. Just to follow on from the talks, I'm just putting a link in for there's a festival of action at the end of the month about the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a free event, which I think a lot of the people on this call would probably be interested in. And Russ also mentioned that he's on Clubhouse. So anyone that's got an iPhone and isn't already on Clubhouse and wants an invite, I've got some invites, but Russ is a moderator for a sustainability club on there. And there's tons of really interesting conversations, a lot around fashion and the circular economy, but also on all areas of the Sustainable Development Goals for anybody that's kind of wanting to kind of delve in and educate themselves a bit more on how those different frameworks can help them change their own behaviour in their business. So those are just some resources I wanted to share.
Thanks, Hannah. So I think we're going to end today, but well, let's all leave on a positive note. We're all here, we're all having the conversation, we're all making small changes, we're all connecting. If there's anyone in particular wants to talk about what they're doing that they haven't said already, please do. But I think the thing is, let's just keep making those small changes, let's keep making that impact, and we can all make the world a better place for ourselves, for the business, for the planet, and and for each other. Is there anything else you want to add to there, Hannah or Russ or Joe?
Just want to say thanks again for inviting me, and it's been a really great hour.
Thanks, Russ. Great to have you. Thanks, everyone. If anyone wants to stay for an extra 10-15 minutes for chit chat, we'll Hannah and I will stay on.
Yeah, we'll still be here.
Thanks for that, Paul.
Thanks, everyone. That was great.
Yeah, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. Tons and tons of notes.
That's good. That's a good sign.
It is a good sign.
That's a good sign.
What's
Good.
the big thing? Are you working on lots of incentives at the moment, Paul? Or is there a particular big thing that you're working on at the moment? Or is it lots of things?
Me? I like doing lots of things at one time, and but yeah, there are. So I'm working on trying to get the government in the UK on track regarding what it says it wants to do on environment, climate, specifically nature, broadly. Some of that's parliamentary work, so the post-Brexit environment bill and the agriculture bill and the fisheries bill. I'm doing quite a lot on pesticides issues, have done in the past, and that's popping up again right now. I'm doing a fair amount on peat issues as well, garden peat and whatever, which we really should be not buying. I'm even writing a paper about trams. Yeah, the role of trams in urban living and stuff like that. I'm doing quite a lot on offsetting, carbon offsetting and biodiversity offsetting. I've done some work on that in the past, but I'm trying to refresh it. And so, yeah, it's whatever. I'm even doing some stuff on 5G, actually looking at the impacts of 5G and light as well, lighting issues, how blue, white, rich light, LED lighting affects bees, well, less bees, but more moths and insects, and how 5G might be affecting bees and other creatures. So my job is pretty varied. Yeah, life is not dull.
You know, when people talk about the issues of HS2, which is massive.
Yeah.
It's such a difficult conversation, isn't it? Because, biodiversity is massively getting affected with HS2 getting built, and yet but then the government, has these climate goals, and yet they're these massive projects which huge controversy. I know you said bad stuff will always happen, and that's just inevitable. How do you even balance those conversations when you've got such deprivation happening, and yet we're trying to do stuff in our own back gardens which probably isn't even going to match the deprivation?
No. Well, it's again, I guess it's about having putting things in perspective. So I've worked on some big infrastructure projects over the years. Terminal 5 Heathrow was the big one, which we obviously lost, but actually we have almost had to lose that in order to kind of make the bigger points about airport expansion and runways and things like that. Road schemes, so the Newbury bypass and the M4 through Winchester, Twyford Down. I was a veteran of both those campaigns, and also massive motorway building across most of London that the government wanted to do in the early 80s, and massive public campaigns against massive road building across Streatham Common, all the way, basically huge interurban motorways. I think any action you take is always good. Trying to compare making your garden wildlife friendly with the fact that HS2 has destroyed considerable amounts of ancient woodland in the UK is almost being unfair to yourself. So put it in perspective. Funnily enough, Friends of the Earth was kind of pro HS2, but we didn't like the route. We didn't have a problem with high-speed rail per se, but the way you route these things is the problem. And the problem with so much transport infrastructure, roads and rail, is because the Department of Transport and the Treasury measure things based on a certain economic model, they can put the data in and they'll come out with the right answer, which will basically say it values the journey time that's saved more than anything else. So they give more of a mark to, so that the whole argument for HS2 from London to Birmingham is that it will cut the amount of journey time between London and Birmingham by 20 minutes or something. And that the Treasury and the Department of Transport give that more of a rating than any of the downsides, the costs, if you like. And so the balance will always come out that they'll route it in a certain way because it's you know, it's Alice in Wonderland economics, but this is what happens with these bigger infrastructure projects. So I think also the government got itself into talking up the idea of HS2, that it got to a point where it was too far, it'd gone too far down the road, it couldn't really back out, you know. And politicians don't like being accused of doing U-turns, even though they do them all the time. So, you know, so yeah, I think it could have been done in a way that would still be really effective as a train route, but not through landscapes and heritage, natural heritage that we actually need to be protecting. So, and government says, well, the trees, we'll plant more trees, but that's not the point. You cannot replace ancient woodland. You cannot replace ancient woodland. Is classically defined as something over 200 or 400 years old. You know, so it's a bit of a nonsense, really. So, you know, also in carbon terms, HS2 won't do anything for carbon. It's carbon intensive development. So, but you have to look at the motivations. Governments want ground projects because there seem to be things they can point. Ministers love to cut the ribbon on a big development and then point to it as something they did, you know, because otherwise all the little things don't add up to enough that people can say, look, we really did. But actually the answer is, if we all did the right stuff in our gardens, wildlife would be great, you know, wouldn't have a problem. If all farmers farmed in ways which are just about the way they farmed on their land, then wildlife would be thriving in our countryside. But it isn't, because the way we farm is wrong. So you can stack all those things up. The reason our environment is degraded in the UK and globally, the reason so many species are in trouble, is down to the things that we do tend to do. So if we prioritize those things and then stack them all up, we could have a really big effect, you know. But politicians tend to like big things, yeah, which is why they say, oh, we're going to plant 1 million trees. And my answer to that is, why 1 million? Where? How are you going to look after them? Are they going to reach maturity? And they can never answer that. They just say, well, 1 million's good, isn't it? I said, well, why not 1.5 million or 1.1 million, or you're one short of 1 million? And they don't know. So you've got to, as I said, you've got to know which lever you're pulling and why, as opposed to, oh, let's just plant some trees. Yeah. You know, so, and we can get clever about this because the data helps us make those decisions. The evidence tells you what type of tree you should be planting, almost to the street. Yeah, there's mapping that says, if you want to plant, have massive effect of the right type of tree in the park or on the street or in a forest half up a mountain, these are the species you should grow with this amount different gap, and this is how you need to make sure they reach maturity. Because there's so many trees that are put in the ground which are part of tree planting initiatives which die, you know. So, and not all trees are the same. So a tree planted in an upland environment will not perform the same way as a tree planted in an urban environment or a lowland environment. It will capture different rates of carbon, it will capture different types of, it will do different things in terms of air pollution and what have you. So all trees are not the same, and they're certainly not the same in the same place. So, but the data can help us with this. You know, this is why the help does exist, to make good and better decisions, rather than just kind of come up with a figure and then some. It's what I call initiative-itis. Drives me bonkers. You know, so. But there, there's some really, some really good stuff, and I think we need to be championing more of the good stuff and helping people feel confident to do that, and then I think more people will say, yeah, I want to play my part in that. So
yeah, the point of Hannah and I hosting these sessions is to really talk to businesses and help businesses or brands. As you say, it starts at design stage. So, designing your business from the start is really key for that. And then from that is, the types of decisions you make, the types of people you work with, the suppliers that you use. It's this kind of knock-on effect, and about making good decisions as a business. And like you say, it's got to start with us, because that will then force the bigger changes.
And the fashion point is really into, because it's so personal. It's a bit like food. We're seeing quite a revolution in food. I mean, food, the production of food and the waste of food is huge. And I have to bite my lip. Well, I did retweet someone who had the same thought about this story, that suddenly flying is going to be sustainable because we'll make fuel out of waste food. Well, hang on. Why are we wasting the food in the first place? Waste food has carbon intensity. So it's not suddenly, hang on, that's not solving a problem. That's just allowing people who can afford to fly, which is not the majority of people, to fly more, thinking they've solved a problem when they probably haven't. So hang on, that doesn't add up. And this is, anyone who knows their sustainability would say, no, hang on, you've pulled the wrong lever again. But fashion and food are absolutely touchstone issues, aren't they? Because they're, I mean, I love your point, Joanna. I when you said digital clothing, I was thinking, yeah, but what if I get cold? It's like, and then your answer is, yeah, but it'll keep you warm or something. They'll all be solar paneled or something.
I mean, the idea is effectively, we might also be wearing like a base layer with tracking points, and then a big flight.
You're making me feel uncomfortable now. It's like big brotherish to me.
No, but I mean, I think unless we start to explore these things, then we shouldn't limit ourselves by what exists already. But it was interesting, Gina, when you said, well, what can we do? And for me, the most sustainable thing you can do is love what you already own. Repair what you already own. And I think there was this push away from, I'm not going to mend anything because I can afford to buy new. And I think it's really retraining the culture in terms of, if you look in your wardrobe, you have these pieces that you really treasure and you put care into them, and you have an infrastructure of repair, which we don't necessarily have now. It's more expensive to repair.
I totally agree. When you were all talking, I thought I want to chime in, but we could be talking about this for hours. But there's almost two parts of the problem, which is the manufacturing and the design process of the businesses, but also the advertising and the consumer attitude towards buying those products. Because when Russ was saying, it's not fair on people with low income, I felt like saying, well, I was brought up in a single parent family with 3 sisters. I got my first brand new outfit when I was 13 years old from Tammy Girl. Up until that point, I wasn't walking around naked. I was wearing clothes from jumble sales and charity shops because that was available now. And actually with technology, with platforms like eBay and Vinted, it's actually quite easy to get that, and Depop to even get to still have access to goods at an affordable price. But it's about that consuming shift in attitude, like even from when we were kids, when there was 2 seasons in the fashion closet, to now there being a new season almost every week and a new trend every day. So it's the problem that you're solving in your role, Joanna, is so complex, because it's trying to get these 2 different things to work together. Because even if the amazing design and technology is created and happens, it's about getting that consumer uptake of actually using that, as opposed to still sticking with the model they've got at the moment. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack there.
You know, me and Gina have had a lot of chats recently, and I was like, I'm going to have to just rein it in, because almost once you start, you'll know yourself, but once you start to look into these things, it's complex. You know, it's not as straightforward as just, you know, so many people just say, well, ban fast fashion, slow down fashion. And I say, well, okay, but you know, where, if somebody wants something new, you know, where do they go? And this emotional need, why we buy something, often it's not because we need a physical item of clothing, there's an emotional need attached to it. How do you address that? Do you then force people into more polluting industries? Do they buy beauty? Do they buy from less ethical retailers? You know, and then when you start to look into the supply chain of it all, there's so many different facets to it. And to me, a lot of the changes we can make exist now. That's why I'm so passionate about digital, you know, and the pre-consumer side of things, because it's there, there's a saving already. Yeah, you know, in the circular economy, we talk so much about emotional durability, and I think there's not enough research on it because it's really hard to measure it. But I think when you get to the crux of why do people buy fashion, what's it doing for them, you know, if it's not a physical need, you can really start to change behaviors, and you can sell stories. Like sheep ink is interesting because it shows you the sheep that makes your hat or your garment, you know, and what enables that is a blockchain technology. So it's looking at the holistic you know, setting of putting all those things together, bringing technology and nature together. So yeah, there's so many facets to it, and that's why I find it exciting. You know, I talked to Gina because for me, I love it in terms of fashion. It was art, it was a craft. You know, if you go into the V&A and you see these garments, there's an artistry to it, and I think fashion has become this really dirty word. And for me, I want to celebrate. Okay, well, there's creativity in this, you know, and there's an art to it, and I think we should find a way with the resources that we have and the future resources to bring that back again, really.
But it's become a dirty word partly because it's so connected with rampant consumerism, and then waste and processes and pollution. And so, you know, what is the future model of Boohoo? What is the future model of Primark? You know, are they going to start claiming that they're net zero companies and biodiverse and, you know, using kind of natural dyes and what have you? Well, I don't know. Maybe they are. Maybe they will at some point. But you're right. I think there's this thing about, you know, we know a lot of the things that we just need to do, and some of those aren't complicated because they've been shown what they can do. So it's easy to say, well, the solutions are simple. Well, and in many ways they are. Sometimes they involve doing nothing. So your garden will grow perfectly well without you pouring pesticides on it. Save yourself some money. You know, hey, do you want to save money and not pollute the planet? Well, don't go and buy pesticides. That's simple. But then a lot of these things, it's not you can turn it around and say, well, if it's not complex, it isn't working as well, because we shouldn't kid ourselves about how complex some of this stuff is, and the complexity is a help. It's almost a privilege, you know. So the complexity shows that you're trying to do things differently, and you're trying to create new models, and it isn't about silver bullets or instant answers. So it's getting a bit philosophical, but it does cut to the heart of how people feel they're able to make change, I think. So, and this is why, as someone who does a lot of work with government, I'm always, you know, it's this constant balance between trying to applaud a government that has finally said something quite useful, but it's never really where it needs to be. And then you have to point out the downsides to why something isn't good enough, or a policy position is lacking, or how the money they're investing is going to fall short. And that happens all the time. But you have to bank it, because it's at least edging forward or creating a space in which society can move. So again, I'm in danger of being too positive on the call, but I've learned how to deal with that. You know, I'm used to things not being where they need to be, but I still get up in the morning, you know, and I can look at the progress that is made. And I think also it's about saying, well, okay, there are a bunch of people, you know, it's really interesting seeing the people on the call, most of whom I've never met, you know, before, and wouldn't in any other fora necessarily, unless I was invited to speak at a fashion event or what have you, conference. I did some stuff with London College of Fashion a few years ago, and that kind of opened some doors. But on the whole, it's this coming together of people who don't normally come together, which I think is really, you know, it's almost creating a quiet revolution that's really hard to track. It's a bit like all these apps that help you. What you said, Hannah, there's all these apps and, you know, different platforms where it's happening, and it's not necessarily instantly trackable, you know. So that's why government tends not to know what's going on half the time. So, you know,
Yeah.
my job is to try and help government do better, because it can see where society is shifting, or where the companies that do want to do something and are going to plant a flag. You know, my job is to do that, as well as to hopefully empower or enthuse people to say, yeah. But I think one of the big challenges, I don't know what you think about this, Gina and Hannah or others, one of the things that I keep coming across is I don't want people to go through the same slow learning curve that I see other people have done in past. What's the fast? What does doing it well but doing it fast look like?
Yeah.
So you get up to speed quickly rather than these slow learning curves.
Yeah. I think in business, it's about when you're talking, like I'm certainly finding, if I can show a business that by being sustainable, it's going to make them more money, it's like the quickest, easiest way for them to suddenly to get everybody in that company on board with the idea of creating a sustainable strategy and implementing a sustainable framework. Because it's often there will be 2 or 3 people within an organization who are up to speed, and it's almost trying to persuade everybody else that this is the morally way to do it. But if I can turn around and give tangible financial implications on how being more sustainable as a company is going to benefit their business, it's almost like that's making companies really shift quickly into seeing, oh, so if you've got evidence that if we treat our employees better, that they're going to stay with my company for longer, so I'm not going to have such a high employee turnover rate, so it's going to save me money in my hiring practices. Oh, right, okay. And it's almost what happened 100 years ago with the labour and trade union saying, do you know what, if you give people 2 days off work at the weekend, they're going to be better at working on a Monday. I mean, that all came around because people would have Sunday off, go crazy. There was something called Saint Monday, where basically people went into work late and were completely unproductive on Mondays because they'd all gone out and kind of partied on a Sunday after church. And the labour unions and the trade unions and then kind of everybody got together and thought, oh God, this is costing us money, and like how can we make this work for business? And labour and trade unions were like, you know, if you give people 2 days off and they have a chance to relax and have time with their friends and family, they'll all go crazy on Saturday, they'll recover on Sunday, and they'll be great for back to work on Monday. And all the companies in the UK were like, okay, let's make weekends a thing. So that was only 100 years ago. It's making businesses kind of see that in the same sense, where, oh, what, having a good environmental impact.
So I get that in terms of making the case,
yeah,
and giving the organization or even the people who want to go in that direction the rationale. But then you've got to know what you're doing afterwards, isn't it? It's the journey you go on, isn't there? So how do you make, so, you know, so you always get this, I mean, it's probably a poor example, but again, a basic one is, you know, oh, do I recycle? Should I recycle this or should I not? Or should I, it's almost like, well, hang on, how do you you've then got to have information in front of you to be able to make some decisions, haven't you? And that's complicated. So I'm just wondering whether, you know, in the plethora of guides and templates and advice, you know, there's something about building, it's probably not about the pure information. It's probably more about how do we create the capacity so people can find the right way of approaching something once they're convinced, so that they get up to speed quickly, you know, they don't end up disappearing down rabbit holes, which I suspect is quite easy.
Yeah, and
to
I
do.
think there was a really good report on sustainability by Wunderman Thompson, and they said something like 75% of people want to recycle, but then actually we delved in and only 25% of people are actually doing it. And it's having that from the intention of knowing it's a good thing to do to then making it an easy and affordable thing to do. So it's the education, but it's not just the education, because I think most people know plastic bottles are bad, but then I'm still seeing, even in the supermarket now, there's still some people buying the plastic bags at the checkout. And I'm thinking, well, it's actually been made quite difficult for you to do that now. So people are starting to bring in reusable. So there's this almost like a couple of different points you're looking at, which is the education level of it, but then it making it an easier, more convenient option anyway. So it's also, I think, in sustainability, a lot of it is making it cool. Once it becomes cool to be sustainable, it will be a lot easier to convince people to do it.
I think from Joe's point earlier as well, it's the brand or the business's responsibility can't just stop when they've sold you the product. So when you've got that Coke, well, Coca-Cola is a really bad example, but when you've got an Oatly carton and it's Tetra Pak, and your local council doesn't recycle Tetra, it becomes your problem. And I think that's also part of the issue. And going back to points or links, going back to Paul's, it's the design. It starts right at the beginning, and thinking about end of life right at the beginning of the conversation. It should then become the consumer's problem. The business or the brand needs to then take some responsibility to close that circle.
That's an interesting one, because I think another factor that might be coming in. So let's take the Coca-Cola bottle cap, yeah, the plastic cap that ends up in the Antarctic. Whose responsibility is that? Yeah, well, the company sold it to you, you bought it, you threw it away. Hang on, the waste company took it and then they exported it, and then, oh, hang on, what's it doing? You know, or so that's one thing. That's, you know, there's a bit of a debate going on with that. I think the other one, which is really interesting, to get onto Joanna's point about, you know, real almost kind of micro level technology, the ability to track and trace. So probably not the right expression, but the ability to trace pollutants that end up in. So let's say you fall ill with a disease and it's put down to a certain element in the water or the food or the air. The ability increasingly now through genomic sequencing, the ability to almost trace where the problem element came from, even if it was a factory in Siberia. Yeah, that is, I think that's going to become a bit of a driver actually for the whole issue of corporate responsibility, product responsibility, because I'm not ruling out at all the fact that legal class actions will come against companies or sectors whose products are found to have essentially been responsible for, you know, deleterious health. I think that's increasingly the way how genome sequencing is potentially going to be used to drive change. So that could be a bit of a game changer as well, you know.
Yeah, and I think it's the complication of you saying that almost businesses need to shift and push government towards creating better and new policies, but also unless the government creates better and new policies, businesses aren't going to shift. So it's almost you're at an impasse in a lot of these discussions, because actually,
well, I see it as a constant flow. It's a bit push me pull you-ish, you know. It ebbs and flows at any one time. But yeah, much as I would love government to lead, my natural default is it won't. Therefore, how do we create the conditions where people do want? And government says, "Hey, that's a good idea. We'll steal that." I would love government to steal all my ideas, yeah, or my organisation's ideas. In the meantime, we have to do what we need to do, yeah. So So again, without, you can get very depressed in this game unless you constantly remind yourself that progress is being made. And there's a wider circle of people I'm working with or have conversations with now than I was doing 10 years ago, and certainly 20 years ago, and even longer when I first started this. And none of what I'm doing was planned, I have to admit. I didn't have a conventional career. So I ended up doing this in a completely random, unplanned way. But it's, if the cat fits and all that. But, I think a lot of people are almost asking the same questions I was 20 or 30 years ago. And this is why I'm interested. How can I help you get up to speed quickly rather than you go round the houses? Yeah. Because we don't have time for people to go on their own adventure and get lost in the desert. Yeah. We need to, get up to speed.
I've got a friend at the moment who's actually writing a curriculum to try and teach children the sustainable development goals and what that means, to try and almost have the thinking be embedded, from from your primary school education. So it's almost like, because you're right, it's conversations adults are having to learn about these issues now, because it's just not been something that's been considered or kind of discussed or taught about in school. And that's probably a longer term way to look at it, because Tom's kind of creating this curriculum to try and have the conversation starting at a younger age. But the quicker we can start those conversations beginning earlier on in people's lives, and how their behavior and affects the whole of the world, then it will be a quicker process then in the future for those conversations to be having. Whereas
I do. Although I would like to suggest that picked your age brackets, but I think putting it all on the kids is one thing, and that pays dividends in the future. But I think there's a massive scope for evening classes for adults. But anyway.
I totally echo what you said, Hannah. I think it does start from an early age. I'm looking at teaching kids design thinking, because I'm guest lecturing at Manchester Met tomorrow, but the knowledge that they come out with in terms of industry, in terms of the complexities, isn't necessarily there. And you talked a bit earlier about Boohoo and other businesses, and I really think it starts with leadership. And you have to look at, okay, well, who are the CEOs of these businesses and what do they stand for? And who are they collaborating with? So where we talked about groups before, for me, it's like, okay, well, who's sitting around the table together? And it's those who are kind of just going straight after profits and paying themselves big bonuses versus people who have maybe hopped around the business. So Helena, who's CEO of H&M, was head of production. She was head of sustainability. She has experience in other areas. It's not always been linear. And I think when we start to bring in things like environmental profit and loss, so Kering, who owns a lot of the big brands like Gucci, this is now part of their strategy. And I think we have to add that into the balance, make it a priority and create these cultures from top down to bottom up, that, top down has the knowledge, but bottom up you're incentivized to come with these ideas and come with this innovation. I think it's so important to embed it in that company culture. And, I think also when you're talking about tracking where things come from, the technology now, when we think about the circular economy, it's based on design for disassembly, but being able to disassemble it and actually understand where it's come from and what it is through things like RFID threads, and CEOs almost seeing the importance of that and going, yeah, we're going to invest in it. Having to be a bit visionary, I think, is really important.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
Gosh, could be here all day, couldn't we? It's been really good.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time, everybody. It's been amazing.
Yeah, thanks for staying on.
Pleasure.
Really,
thanks for asking.
No, it was great.
Yeah, great. Okay, good. Well, thanks everyone, and feel free to connect and speak soon.
Thanks. Cheers, Paul. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Hi, Lynn. Good to see you again.